Martha Henderson woke up to another gray morning in Cedar Ridge, just like she had for the past 8 months. The sun was trying to peek through her old curtains, but even the light seemed weaker these days. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty space where her husband Thomas used to sleep. The sheets on his side were still neat and cold, just like her heart had become 8 months. That's how long it had been since the mining accident took Thomas away from her. 8 months since her whole world came crashing down like a house of cards in a windstorm. Back then, people in town had brought food and flowers. They had hugged her and told her everything would be okay. But that was before the bills started piling up. Before the debts Thomas had hidden from her came crawling out of the shadows like hungry wolves. Martha pulled on her worn dress and walked to the kitchen. The floorboards creaked under her feet, reminding her of all the repairs she couldn't afford. She made herself a cup of weak coffee with grounds she had used twice already. Money was tight, tighter than a drum, and every penny had to be stretched until it screamed. She looked out the window at her small ranch. The fence posts were leaning like old men tired of standing. Her cattle, what few she had left, were grazing in the distance. Some days she wondered if she should just sell everything and leave town. But where would she go? This was home, even if home didn't feel very welcoming anymore. The walk to town was the hardest part of her day. Martha had to go to the general store for supplies, but she dreaded it more than a trip to the dentist. As soon as she stepped onto Main Street, she could feel the stares. Women would stop their conversations and look at her like she was carrying some terrible disease. Children would point until their mothers pulled their hands down and whispered sharp words in their ears. "There goes Misfortune," she heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to her friend outside the bakery. The word hit Martha like a slap across the face. Misfortune, that's what they called her now. Not Martha, not Mrs. Henderson, but Misfortune. As if losing Thomas had somehow marked her as cursed, as if bad luck followed her around like a shadow, Martha kept walking, her head held high even though her heart was breaking. She had learned to pretend she couldn't hear the whispers, but they followed her everywhere. In the post office, at the bank, even at church on Sundays. People acted like her husband's death was somehow her fault, like she had brought disaster. To their peaceful little town at the general store, Mr. Collins barely looked up when she entered. He used to greet her with a warm smile and ask about Thomas's work at the mine. Now he just grunted and went back to counting his money. Martha gathered the few items she could afford, some flour, a small piece of salt pork, and thread to mend her clothes. When she put them on the counter, Mr. Collins looked at her with cold eyes. "You still owe $12 from last month," he said, his voice flat and unfriendly. "Can't keep giving you credit forever, you know." Martha's cheeks burned with shame. "I'll have it next week," she promised, even though she wasn't sure how. "The bank said they might give me more time on the loan." Mr. Collins snorted. "Bank's been real patient with you, more patient than most would be, but patience runs out, just like credit." Behind her, Martha heard two women whispering. "Poor thing. Thinks she can keep that ranch running all by herself," one said. "Should have sold it months ago. Nothing but trouble keeping her here." "Trouble follows trouble," the other replied. "That's what my grandmother always said. Some people just attract misfortune wherever they go." Martha paid for her groceries with shaking hands and hurried out of the store. The afternoon sun felt hot on her face, but inside she felt cold as winter ice. She walked past the church where she and Thomas had gotten married 12 years ago. Pastor Williams was outside watering his flowers. He saw her coming and quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in his roses. It hadn't always been this way. Before Thomas died, Martha had been part of the community. She had helped organize church suppers and sewed quilts for new babies. Women had visited her home for tea and shared their secrets and worries. She had been someone who mattered, someone people respected. Now she was Misfortune. The woman whose husband died and left her with nothing but debt and broken dreams. The woman who couldn't keep up with her bills or maintain her property. The woman who reminded everyone that bad things could happen to good people, and that made them uncomfortable. Martha reached her ranch as the sun was setting. The old house looked tired and sad, like it was giving up just like everything else in her life. She fed her few remaining chickens and checked on her cattle. Two of them were missing, probably wandered off through the broken fence she couldn't afford to fix. Inside the house, she lit a single candle to save on lamp oil. The shadows danced on the walls, making the empty rooms feel even lonelier. She sat at the kitchen table where she and Thomas used to eat dinner together, talking about their plans for the future. They had wanted to expand the ranch, maybe raise horses. They had talked about having children, about growing old together. On this land, Martha opened the ledger where she kept track of her finances. The numbers looked back at her like angry red eyes. She owed the bank $300. Mr. Collins at the store wanted his $12. The doctor still needed to be paid for his visits to Thomas before he died. The list went on and on, each debt a heavy stone in her chest. She heard a horse riding past her house, probably one of the cowboys from the big ranch next door. They never stopped to talk anymore. Nobody did. It was like she had become invisible, or worse, like she was bad luck that might rub off on anyone who got too close. Martha blew out the candle and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. She lay in the dark listening to the wind rattle her windows and wondering how much longer she could hold on. The town wanted her gone, that much was clear. They wanted her to disappear so they could forget that sometimes life wasn't fair, that sometimes good people suffered for no reason at all, but Martha Henderson wasn't ready to give up, not yet. She had promised Thomas she would keep their dream alive, and she intended to keep that promise even if it killed her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new reminders that she was Misfortune. But she would face them all with whatever strength she had left. The moon shone through her window, casting silver light across the empty pillow beside her. Martha closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be loved, to be valued, to be more than just a reminder of tragedy. Somewhere in the darkness, she still hoped that better days would come. She had to believe that because hope was all she had left. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after breakfast on a Thursday morning that started like any other. Martha was hanging her laundry on the line behind her house when she noticed it. A rider was coming toward Cedar Ridge, moving slow and steady like he had all the time in the world. She watched him from behind her white sheet, curious despite herself. Strangers didn't come to their little town very often, and when they did, they usually had business at the mine or were just passing through. This man was different. Even from a distance, Martha could tell he sat his horse like he was born in the saddle. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years under the open sky. Two horses followed behind him, their reins loose in his hand. As he got closer, she could see he wore a weathered hat pulled low over his eyes and clothes that had seen better days but were clean and well cared for. Martha finished hanging her laundry and went inside, but she found herself peeking out the window every few minutes. The stranger had reached the edge of town now, and she could see people stopping to stare. Mrs. Patterson was practically hanging out of her shop door, craning her neck to get a better look. Even the children had stopped playing to watch him. Past stop by noon, Martha had to go to town for supplies. She dreaded the trip as always, but her curiosity about the stranger made her walk a little faster than usual. The general store was buzzing with talk when she arrived. Mr. Collins was holding court behind the counter, sharing what little he knew about the newcomer. "Says his name is Jake Sullivan," Collins was telling a small crowd. "Rode in from Colorado. Looking for work. Heard the Pearson Ranch was hiring." "What's his story?" asked Mrs. Patterson, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Man doesn't just show up out of nowhere without a reason." "Didn't say much," Collins replied, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. Quiet type. "But you paid cash for his supplies. So he's got money in his pocket." Martha moved through the store quietly, gathering her few items. She had learned to make herself invisible during these conversations. The less attention she drew, the fewer cruel comments she had to endure. But as she reached for a bag of flour on the high shelf, she couldn't quite reach it. "Allow me, ma'am." The voice was deep and gentle, with a slight drawl that spoke of wide open spaces and long nights under the stars. Martha turned to find herself looking into the kindest brown eyes she had seen in months. The stranger, Jake Sullivan, stood beside her, his hat in his hands and a respectful smile on his weathered face. "Thank you," Martha managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not in front of the whole town. Jake reached up easily and placed the flower in her basket. "You're welcome, ma'am." "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Martha nodded, suddenly aware that the entire store had gone silent. Everyone was watching them, waiting to see what would happen next. She could feel their stares like pinpricks on her skin. This man didn't know who she was, didn't know that talking to her was social suicide in Cedar Ridge. "It is," she said quietly, then hurried to pay for her groceries before the whispers could start. But Jake Sullivan didn't seem to notice or care about the audience. He tipped his hat politely as she left, treating her like she was a lady worth respecting. Martha felt a warmth in her chest that she had almost forgotten existed. Outside, she heard Mrs. Patterson's voice rise above the others. "Someone should warn him about that one. Bad luck follows her everywhere she goes." Martha's face burned with shame, but she kept walking. She had made it halfway down Main Street when disaster struck. Her old mare, Bessie, had been acting tired lately, but Martha couldn't afford to replace her. The horse had been standing patiently outside the store, but as Martha approached, Bessie suddenly swayed and collapsed. "Bessie!" Martha dropped her groceries and ran to the horse's side. Bessie was breathing hard, her eyes rolling with pain and exhaustion. Martha knelt beside her, running her hands over the horse's neck, trying to comfort her. People began to gather around, but they kept their distance. Martha could hear their whispers. "Poor horse," someone said. "Should have been put out to pasture years ago." Another voice added, "She can't even take care of her animals properly." Martha fought back tears as she tried to help Bessie stand. The horse was too weak, too old, too tired. And Martha was too proud to ask for help from people who had already made it clear they wanted nothing to do with her. Then Jake Sullivan was there, kneeling beside her in the dust. He didn't say anything at first, just ran his experienced hands over Bessie's legs and sides, checking for injuries. His touch was gentle but sure, the touch of a man who understood horses. "She's not hurt," he said quietly, his voice meant only for Martha, "just exhausted." "When's the last time she had a proper rest?" Martha's cheeks burned with shame. I've been working her hard lately. Had to get to town more often, and she's all I have." Jake nodded without judgment. "We all do what we have to do." "Help me get her up." Together they coaxed Bessie too. Her feet, the horse stood shakily, but she was standing. Jake examined her more closely, running his hands along her back and legs. "She needs grain and rest," he said. "Good grass and clean water. Maybe some of that liniment old Doc Peterson keeps at the pharmacy." Martha's heart sank. She couldn't afford grain, let alone expensive horse medicine. But before she could say anything, Jake was helping her gather her scattered groceries. "I'll walk with you," he said simply. "Make sure she gets home safe." The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the show was over. Martha heard someone mutter, "Fool doesn't know what he's getting into." But Jake either didn't hear or didn't care. They walked slowly through town, Jake leading Bessie while Martha walked beside him. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was the first peaceful moment Martha had experienced in months. This stranger wasn't judging her or whispering about her. He was just being kind. "I'm Martha Henderson," she said finally, as they reached the edge of town. "Jake Sullivan," he replied, touching his hat brim. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Henderson." "It's just Martha," she said, then immediately regretted it. She shouldn't be encouraging conversation with this man. It would only make things harder for both of them. But Jake smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Well then, just Martha, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." As they walked toward her ranch, Martha found herself stealing glances at this mysterious cowboy. He had a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble and lines around. His eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. His clothes were worn but clean, and his boots had seen thousands of miles of hard travel. "You're not from around here," Martha said, immediately feeling foolish for stating the obvious. No, ma'am. Been traveling for a while now. Colorado most recently, but before that, lots of places. Sometimes a man needs to keep moving until he finds where he belongs. There was something in his voice, a sadness that Martha recognized. She knew what it was like to feel lost, to wonder if you'd ever find your place in the world again. When they reached her ranch, Jake helped her get Bessie settled in the small barn. He examined the horse again, this time more thoroughly. Martha watched his hands move with practiced skill, gentle but confident. "She's a good horse," he said finally. "Just needs some care and rest. With the right feed and some attention, she'd be fine." Martha nodded, fighting back tears. She wanted to give Bessie everything she needed, but wanting and being able to afford it were two different things. Jake must have seen something in her expression because his voice became even gentler. Sometimes the best medicine is just time and kindness. Those don't cost anything. As he prepared to leave, Jake turned back to her. "Mrs. Henderson. Martha, thank you for letting me help. It's been a while since I've had the chance to be useful." Martha watched him ride away, leading his two horses toward the Pearson ranch. For the first time in 8 months, she felt like someone had seen her as more than just bad luck walking around in a dress. Jake Sullivan had looked at her and seen a woman worth helping, worth treating with respect. That night, as Martha sat by her window watching the stars, she found herself thinking about kind brown eyes and gentle hands. She told herself not to get her hopes up. Men like Jake Sullivan didn't stay in places like Cedar Ridge. They moved on when the work was done, leaving nothing but memories behind. But for the first time in months, Martha Henderson went to sleep with a smile on her face. 3 days after Jake Sullivan helped her with Bessie, Martha found a small bundle of grain by her barn door. There was no note, no explanation, just enough feed to last her horse a week. She looked around the empty yard, wondering who could have left it. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky pink and gold, and the only sounds were her chickens clucking and the distant lowing of cattle. Martha picked up the grain bag and held it close to her chest. It had been so long since anyone had done something nice for her without expecting anything in return. She tried to tell herself it was probably a mistake, that someone had dropped it by accident. But deep down, she knew better. That evening, as she was checking her fence line, she found 3 broken posts that had been replaced with fresh wood. The work was neat and professional, done by someone who knew what they were doing. The new posts stood straight and strong, holding the wire tight. Martha ran her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling tears prick her eyes. She didn't have to wonder who had done it. There was only one person in Cedar Ridge who would help her without being asked, without expecting praise or payment. Jake Sullivan was working on the Pearson ranch just 2 miles away, close enough to ride over after his regular work was done. Martha wanted to thank him, but she was also afraid. What would people say if they knew he was helping her? What would it mean for his job if word got back to Mr. Pearson? She had already brought enough trouble into people's lives just by existing. She didn't want to ruin things for the first person, who had been kind to her in months, but Jake didn't seem worried about what people might think. The next week, when a fierce storm blew through Cedar Ridge, Martha woke up to find her roof had started leaking. Water was dripping into her kitchen, and she could hear the wind tearing at the loose shingles. She put out every pot and pan she owned to catch the water, but it wasn't enough. She was standing in her flooded kitchen, feeling completely defeated, when she heard horses outside. Through the rain, she could see Jake riding up to her house, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He was soaked to the skin, his hat dripping water, but he was smiling. "Looks like you could use some help," he called out as he dismounted. Martha wanted to tell him to go away, to save himself the trouble and the gossip, but the words stuck in her throat. She needed help so badly, and he was offering it freely. "You'll get sick," she said instead, standing in her doorway. Jake laughed, a warm sound that seemed to push back the gloom of the storm. "Ma'am, I've been wet before. A little rain never hurt anyone." For the next 6 hours, Jake worked on her roof while Martha handed him tools and supplies. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had fixed 100 roofs before. When he couldn't find the right piece of wood, he would cut one to size. When a nail bent, he would pull it out and start over without complaint. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. Martha found herself watching Jake's steady hands as he worked, admiring the way he took care with each shingle, each nail. This wasn't a man who did things halfway. Whatever he put his hand to, he did it right. "You don't have to do this," Martha said when they stopped for a quick meal of bread and coffee. Jake looked at her with those kind brown eyes. "I know I don't have to. I want to. But why?" The question came out before Martha could stop it. "People in town. They'll talk." Jake was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. "Can I tell you something, Martha?" She nodded, suddenly nervous. "I lost my family's ranch 5 years ago. Drought took our crops, and the bank took our land. I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is against you. I know what it's like to be blamed for things that aren't your fault." Martha felt her heart squeeze tight. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be grateful that you're still fighting." "Some people would have given up by now." Jake finished his coffee and stood up. "Your husband was a lucky man, Martha. Lucky to have someone who won't let go of their dreams just because times get hard." They went back to work, but Martha's mind was spinning. No one had talked to her about Thomas in months, and when they did, it was always about his debts or his poor judgment. Jake was the first person to suggest that Thomas had been blessed to have her. Instead of the other way around. By evening, the roof was fixed. Jake had replaced all the damaged shingles and sealed every gap. When Martha looked up at the ceiling, she couldn't see a single leak. The house felt solid and safe for the first time in months. "How much do I owe you?" Martha asked, dreading the answer, but knowing she had to ask. Jake shook his head. "Nothing. Neighbors help neighbors. That's how it's supposed to work." But Martha had been cut off from her neighbors for months. She wasn't part of the community anymore. She was Misfortune, remember? The woman who brought bad luck wherever she went. Jake seemed to read her thoughts. "You know what I see when I look at you?" he said quietly. Martha shook her head, afraid to hear the answer. "I see a woman who gets up every morning and keeps going, even when everything seems hopeless. I see someone who takes care of her animals and her land, even when she's got nothing left to give. I see strength, Martha, real strength." Martha felt tears running down her cheeks. "The town thinks I'm cursed. The town is wrong." Jake's voice was firm, certain. "You're not cursed. You're just a woman who's had some bad luck, and there's a difference." Over the next few weeks, Jake's visits became more regular. He would stop by after work, always with some excuse. Maybe he needed to check on Bessie, or he had extra supplies that would just go to waste. Sometimes he brought news from town, but mostly he just talked. Jake told her about his travels, about the places he'd been and the people he'd met. He had worked on ranches from Texas to Montana, learning something new at every stop. He talked about different ways to raise cattle, about which grasses were best for grazing, about how to read the weather signs in the sky. Martha found herself sharing things she hadn't talked about in years. She told Jake about her dreams for the ranch, about the plans she and Thomas had made. She showed him the account books, pointing out where the numbers didn't add up, where Thomas had made mistakes. "You have a good head for business," Jake said, studying her careful records. "These books are clearer than most I've seen." "Thomas always said I was too worried about money," Martha admitted. "He liked to spend first and worry about paying later." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Some men are dreamers." "Nothing wrong with that, but every dreamer needs someone practical to keep them grounded." It was the first time anyone had suggested that Martha's careful nature was a strength rather than a weakness. Thomas had always made her feel like she was holding him back with her worries about money and her need to plan for the future. Jake began teaching her things about ranching that Thomas had never learned. He showed her how to read the signs that meant cattle were getting sick, how to judge the quality of hay, how to calculate how much pasture land her animals needed. "You're smarter than you think," Jake said one evening as they watched the sunset from her front porch. "With a little more knowledge and the right help, you could make this place profitable." Martha looked out at her small herd of cattle, at the fence posts Jake had repaired, at the barn that was starting to look sturdy again. For the first time since Thomas died, she could imagine a future that didn't involve losing everything. "Why? Are you helping me?" she asked quietly. Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe because I recognize something in you. Maybe because I think everyone deserves a chance to prove the world wrong about them." He turned to look at her, and Martha felt her heart skip a beat. "Or maybe because I think you're worth helping." That night, long after Jake had ridden back to the Pearson ranch, Martha sat by her window and thought about what he had said. She was worth helping, she mattered. Someone believed in her, believed she could succeed. For the first time in 8 months, Martha Henderson felt like she might actually survive this. More than that, she felt like she might even thrive. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Patterson saw Jake leaving Martha's ranch just after sunrise. She was hanging laundry behind her house when she spotted him riding away, and by noon the whole town knew about it. The story grew, with each telling as stories always do in small towns. "He was there all night," Mrs. Patterson told anyone who would listen. "Saw him ride out with my own eyes, bold as brass." Martha knew nothing about the gossip until she went to town for supplies. The moment she walked into the general store, conversation stopped. The silence was different this time, heavier and more dangerous. Mr. Collins barely looked at her, and when he did, his eyes were cold as winter ice. "Heard you've been entertaining visitors," he said as she paid for her flour. Martha's face burned. Red, "I don't know what you mean." "Course you don't." Collins counted her money twice, making a show of checking each coin. Just remember, this is a respectable town. We don't take kindly to certain kinds of behavior." Martha wanted to defend herself, to explain that Jake had only been helping her fix a broken water trough that he had left well before dark. But she knew it wouldn't matter. The town had already decided what they wanted to believe. The whispers followed her down Main Street. "Shameless," she heard someone mutter. "Poor Thomas, barely cold in his grave." Another voice added, "Always knew there was something not right about that woman." Martha hurried home, her heart pounding with shame and anger. She had done nothing wrong, but in a town like Cedar Ridge, the appearance of impropriety was just as damaging as the real thing. That evening, Jake came by as usual to check on her cattle. Martha met him at the fence line, her face tight with worry. "You can't keep coming here," she said without preamble. Jake frowned. "What's wrong?" "People are talking. They're saying things about us, about you being here at night." Jake's jaw tightened. "What kind of things?" Martha couldn't meet his eyes. "You know what kind. They think we're—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Let them think what they want," Jake said firmly. "I'm not going to stop helping you because of small-minded gossip." "But your job, Jake. What if Mr. Pearson hears about this?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "He already has." Martha's heart sank. "What did he say?" "He asked me to stay away from you. Said it was causing problems with his neighbors." "Then you have to listen to him. I won't be responsible for you losing your job." Jake reached through the fence and took her hand. His touch was warm and reassuring, but Martha pulled away. "I'm not going anywhere, Martha. You need help, and I'm going to give it to you." But Jake's defiance came with a price. Over the next few days, Martha noticed that the hostility in town was getting worse. People didn't just whisper about her anymore. They spoke their minds openly. At the post office, Mr. Williams made a point of serving everyone else first, leaving Martha to wait until the very end. "Some people have no shame," he said loudly to the other customers. "Carrying on like that while decent folks are trying to make a living." Martha's hands shook as she collected her mail. There was a letter from the bank, probably another notice about her overdue payments. She stuffed it in her pocket without reading it. At church on Sunday, the situation reached a breaking point. Martha had been attending services regularly, hoping to maintain some connection to the community. But this Sunday felt different. People stared at her more openly, and several families moved to different pews when she sat down. Pastor Williams chose to preach about moral conduct and the dangers of temptation. He never mentioned Martha by name, but his meaning was clear to everyone in the congregation. Martha sat through the entire service. Her cheeks burning with humiliation. After church, as people gathered outside to socialize, Martha overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Someone needs to do something about this situation. Mr. Whitmore from the bank was saying, "It's bad for the whole town's reputation. What do you suggest?" asked Dr. Mitchell. "Well, she owes the bank a considerable sum. Maybe it's time to call in that loan." Martha's heart stopped. If the bank called in her loan, she would lose everything. Her ranch, her home, her animals, all of it would be gone. She hurried home, her mind racing. She had to warn Jake, had to make him understand that his kindness was putting both of them in danger. But when she reached her ranch, she found something that made her stomach turn. Her well had been poisoned. The water was cloudy and foul-smelling, and floating on the surface were the bodies of her 3 remaining chickens. Someone had deliberately contaminated her water supply, killing her birds and leaving her without clean water for herself or her animals. Martha sank to her knees beside the well, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just gossip anymore. Someone had committed a deliberate act of sabotage, and she knew it was because of her friendship with Jake. Jake arrived an hour later to find Martha sitting on her porch steps, staring at nothing. He took one look at the poisoned well and the dead chickens, and his face went dark with anger. "Who did this?" he demanded. "I don't know," Martha whispered. "Could have been anyone." Jake knelt beside her. "We need to report this to the sheriff." Martha laughed bitterly. "You think Sheriff Morrison will care? He's probably in on it." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to his horse. Martha thought he was leaving, thought she had finally pushed him away. But instead he began unloading supplies from his saddlebags. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm moving into your barn," Jake said matter-of-factly. "If someone's going to threaten you, they'll have to go through me first." "Jake, no." "You don't understand. This will ruin you." Jake looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "Martha, I've been ruined before. I survived it then, and I'll survive it now, but I won't survive watching you get hurt because of me. People will say, let them say whatever they want. I know who I am, and I know who you are. That's all that matters." Jake set up his bedroll in the barn and turned Martha's ranch into a fortress. He fixed the well, cleaning it thoroughly and installing a new pump. He'd built a better chicken coop with stronger wire to protect any new birds they might get. He reinforced the fence around the house and set up a system of ropes and bells that would alert them if anyone tried to approach at night. But the attacks continued. Someone cut their fence lines, allowing Martha's cattle to wander onto neighboring property. She was fined $20 by the town council for letting her animals graze on land that didn't belong to her. $20 she didn't have. Then Jake lost his job. Mr. Pearson rode out to the ranch personally to deliver the news. "Nothing personal, Sullivan," Pearson said, not looking Jake in the eye. "But the other ranchers in the area are threatening to stop doing business with me if I keep you on. Can't afford to lose their cooperation." Jake accepted the news without complaint. "I understand, Mr. Pearson. Thanks for keeping me on as long as you did." After Pearson left, Martha broke down completely. "This is all my fault," she sobbed. "I've ruined your life." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You haven't ruined anything. You've given me something to fight for." That night, as they sat by the fire in Martha's kitchen, Jake made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to marry you," he said quietly. Martha looked up at him in shock. "What?" "I'm going to marry you, Martha. I'm going to stand up in front of this whole town and declare my intentions. Let them try to gossip about my wife. Jake, you can't. You don't understand what you're saying. I understand perfectly. I love you, Martha Henderson. I love your strength and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to give up. I love the way you take care of your animals and the way you keep fighting even when everything seems hopeless." Martha felt her heart breaking and healing at the same time. "I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm telling you. Tomorrow I'm going to the pastor and asking him to announce our engagement. Then we'll see what this town has to say about that." Martha looked into Jake's eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in months. Hope, real, honest hope. Maybe it was time to stop running from the storm and start fighting back. Jake kept his word. The next morning, he walked into Cedar Ridge wearing his best shirt and carrying his hat in his hands. Martha watched from her window as he rode toward town, her heart pounding with fear and pride. She knew what he was about. To do would change everything, one way or another. Pastor Williams was weeding his garden when Jake arrived at the church. The pastor looked up nervously as Jake approached. Word had already spread about the cowboy living in Martha Henderson's barn, and Williams wasn't eager for confrontation. "Pastor Williams," Jake said respectfully, "I'd like to speak with you about announcing my engagement." The pastor's face went pale. "Your engagement? To Martha Henderson?" "I plan to marry her as soon as possible." Pastor Williams dropped his gardening tool and stared at Jake like he'd announced he was planning to marry the devil himself. "Young man, I don't think you understand the situation here." "I understand it perfectly," Jake replied calmly. "I'm in love with a good woman who's been treated poorly by this town. I want to marry her and give her the respect she deserves." The pastor looked around nervously, as if the whole town was listening. In a way, they were. Mrs. Patterson was visible across the street, clearly straining to hear every word. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside," William said quickly, but Jake shook his head. "No, Pastor. I'm not ashamed of my intentions. I want the whole town to know that Martha Henderson is going to be my wife." His voice carried across the street, and Martha, watching from her ranch, saw curtains twitching in windows all over town. By noon, every person in Cedar Ridge would know about Jake's proposal. The reaction was swift and harsh. That evening, a group of men rode out to Martha's ranch. She and Jake were sitting on the porch when they saw the dust cloud approaching. Jake stood up slowly, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Stay inside," he told Martha, but Martha stood beside him. "We face this together." The men stopped at the fence line. Sheriff Morrison was there, along with Mr. Whitmore from the bank, Dr. Mitchell, and several other prominent townsmen. Their faces were grim, and Martha could smell whiskey. "On the wind, Sullivan," the sheriff called out. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," Jake replied. "This has gone far enough. You're causing problems for everyone. I'm not causing problems. I'm trying to marry the woman I love," Mr. Whitmore urged his horse forward. "That woman owes the bank $300. Her loan is past due, and we're calling it in." Martha's heart sank. $300 might as well have been $3,000. She didn't have it, and she never would. "When?" Jake asked quietly. "End of the week. She pays up or loses everything." The men rode away, leaving Martha and Jake standing in the growing darkness. Martha felt like her world was crumbling again, but Jake's voice was steady. "How much do you have saved?" he asked. $47, Martha whispered. Jake nodded. "I have about 120. That's not enough, but it's a start." "Jake, there's no way. Even if we had the money, they'd find another excuse to get rid of me." "Maybe, but I'm not giving up without a fight." The next few days were a blur of desperate activity. Jake sold his horses, keeping only his saddle horse. He sold his saddle, his rifle, everything he owned of value. Martha sold her few pieces of jewelry and her mother's china set. They scraped together every penny they could find, but it still wasn't enough. Then, on Friday morning, everything changed. Martha was in town buying supplies when she heard the church bell ringing frantically. It wasn't Sunday, and it wasn't the regular hour for services. The bell kept ringing, urgent and desperate, calling everyone to come quickly. People poured out of shops and houses, running toward the sound. Martha followed, her heart racing. As she turned the corner near the church, she saw smoke rising from the schoolhouse. The building was on fire. Children were screaming and crying as their teacher, Miss Peterson, tried to get them out safely. The fire had started in the back of the building and was spreading fast. Black smoke poured from the windows, and Martha could see flames dancing on the roof. Most of the adults stood frozen, unsure what to do. But Martha didn't hesitate. She ran toward the building, pushing through the crowd. "Form a line," she shouted. "We need buckets, water from the well." But people just stared at her. Misfortune, telling them what to do? They couldn't trust her judgment. What if she made things worse? Then Jake appeared, running from the direction of her ranch. He must have seen the smoke and ridden hard to get there. Without stopping to think, he plunged into the burning building. Jake! Martha screamed, but he was already gone. Seconds later, he emerged carrying two small children, their clothes singed and their faces streaked with soot. He handed them to their parents and immediately turned back toward the fire. "We need a bucket brigade," Martha shouted again. This time, seeing Jake's courage, a few people began to move. Martha organized the water line while Jake made trip into the burning building. Each time he came out with another child, Martha's heart stopped until she saw him emerge safely. The smoke was getting thicker, and she could see that the flames were spreading to the front of the building. "That's all of them," Miss Peterson called out, counting heads frantically. "All the children are out." But Jake was still inside. Martha could see him through the smoke-filled doorway, beating at the flames with his coat, trying to save what he could of the building. "Jake," she called, "get out. It's not worth it." Just then, a burning beam fell from the ceiling, crashing down right where Jake had been standing. Martha screamed and ran toward the building, but strong hands held her back. "You can't go in there!" Sheriff Morrison shouted. Then Jake stumbled out, his shirt torn and his face black with soot. He was coughing hard, but he was alive. Martha broke free from the sheriff's grip and ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "Don't ever do that again," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jake held her tight. Had to make sure everyone was safe. They had saved most of the building. The fire was out, and while there was damage, it could be repaired. More importantly, every child was safe. Not one had been seriously hurt. As the crowd began to disperse, something had changed. People were looking at Martha and Jake differently. Mrs. Patterson approached them hesitantly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My grandson was in there." "If you hadn't organized the bucket brigade," Dr. Mitchell nodded. "Quick thinking, Mrs. Henderson. You probably saved the whole building." Even Sheriff Morrison tipped his hat. "Good work, both of you." Over the next few days, people began approaching Martha with quiet apologies. They brought food for her table and offers to help with her ranch work. Pastor Williams visited personally to apologize for his cold treatment. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. "Both of you. You're good people, and I'm sorry it took a fire to make me see it." The bank extended Martha's loan, and several ranchers offered to buy cattle from her at fair prices. Mr. Pearson even offered Jake his job back, though Jake politely declined. "I'm going to help Martha build up her ranch," he said. "We're going to do it together." On a snowy December evening, as Martha sat by the fire in her warm, secure home, Jake knelt beside her chair. He pulled out a simple gold ring. Nothing fancy, but it was real, and it was meant for her. "Martha Henderson," he said softly, "you've made me believe in tomorrow again. Will you marry me?" Martha looked down at this man who had stood by her when the whole world turned against her. He had seen her at her worst and had chosen to love her anyway. He had shown her that she wasn't cursed or unlucky. She was just a woman who had been waiting for the right man to see her worth. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding was small but beautiful. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and half the town attended. Mrs. Patterson brought flowers from her garden, and Dr. Mitchell played the piano. Even Mr. Whitmore from the bank wished them well. As Jake kissed his bride, Martha thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been called Misfortune, had been blamed for things beyond her control, had been made to feel worthless and cursed. But Jake had shown her the truth, that she had always mattered, had always been worthy of love and respect. Martha Henderson Sullivan had learned that sometimes the greatest storms in life are followed by the most beautiful rainbows. And sometimes when you think you've lost everything, life gives you something better than you ever dared to dream. The woman who had once been called Misfortune was now the luckiest woman in Cedar Ridge. She had found love, respect, and most importantly, she had found herself again.